Today we're going to talk about the financial side of Bitcoin and how that's going to be incorporated into business. And we have a very special guest. Our guest today is Jordan Guess of Bitment. And welcome to the show. What's great about your day?
Today is great for me because it is April 17th. So my day job is doing tax work. So we just got through on Tuesday the big deadline, which I know no one's excited about, but I'm excited to get through it. And so took yesterday off with my family and back at it today a little bit, kind of easing into it all, work wise. So yeah, I'm happy to be here. Anytime that I can step away from my fiat job, predominantly fiat job, and step into something to do with Bitcoin, I'm happy to do so. So yeah, I'm excited to dig into it today.
And it's such a perfect time because it's April 15th is like when spring starts. And so when that's over, you're going out of like the dark season and into the fun season or into the bright and sunny season. So that's it's very symbolic and great.
Yeah.
You're in Bitment, and Bitment, we're going to dive into what it does, but in order to make that company, you got orange pilled, you got into Bitcoin. What did that look like for you?
Yeah, so my background is in accounting. So I've been dealing with the double entry accounting world for quite some time. I studied that in college, graduated in 2017. Um, and then I went directly into public accounting, doing tax and small business, bookkeeping, accounting, that kind of stuff. So I've always had that background. Heard about Bitcoin probably for the first time really in college. Had a buddy who got in. I remember at the time he put like $6,000 into it, which when you're in college, or at least for me, $6,000 was just the most insane amount of money I'd ever heard. And it ran up to the 20K, and then it ran all the way back down. And I remember thinking, "Wow, that guy's really silly for losing that amount of money, basically from on that way down from 20 to 6." So I heard about it, but really, like so many other people, just dismissed it. And yeah, I mean, I even started hearing about it more as I got into my career a little bit, and didn't really start down the rabbit hole until 2020, and when Sailor went on Breedlove's show. I mean, that's what orange pilled me really, was those first 10 hours of that series, and just learning even just the basics about the fundamentals of gold and sound money and hard money, and why the system we operate under currently is completely, is just lopsided, messed up. So
And so tell us a little bit about your background. You got into business, you got into finance, and that really
yeah.
shaped your uh, your ability to watch those shows because you were watching those shows because they're part of your livelihood.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, so started off working in a small firm. Worked there for about 3 years. I actually went into just regular corporate accounting for about a year, and that was right about the time I got my CPA license. So I was working there and accidentally started my own CPA firm. Basically, some clients from the old firm followed me over and asked if I'd continue doing their stuff. I just gotten the license, so I started my own firm here in Kentucky, and did that on the side of working in that corporate accounting job for about 12, 13 months. That was also during COVID. So that was, I always say COVID kind of helped my business get started, because, there's all kinds of money that the government was throwing out the window to help small business owners and individuals. And so business owners were like, "Hey, I need a CPA to help me get the PPP loan or get this tax credit." And so that helped propel that business a little bit quicker. And then it didn't hurt to be working from home for my corporate job. I could, go do networking events, and as long as I was strategic with keeping my like Slack type of tool showing that I was active, I could go do those things and kind of build the business while making sure I had all my obligations met. And it probably wouldn't have been the same if I was working in the office. I don't know how everyone's job works, but at that corporate job, it was very strict. You were there at 8 a.m. You left no sooner than 5, and you know, for lunch. And they, my manager is pretty. He was when before COVID hit, he was on me about you have to be sitting in front of your desk basically during the working hours. So there wouldn't have been any flexibility to build a business. But thankfully, I was never under any non-solicit or anything that kept me from building a business on the side. And you know, I think I was kind of lucky to just um, be able to do that. And then going forward, I started my own firm. I've had my own firm now, I guess, for 5 years, and it's mostly tax, but there's also accounting that's built in. And to kind of segue into why we're talking, I started with the 2021 crazy Bitcoin run up and everything. I started working with some um, Bitcoin and other crypto related companies or clients. And so I ended up doing some tax returns slash bookkeeping for those type of clients. And so that also kind of took me even further down the rabbit hole of just cryptocurrency and what are the tax implications, what are the tax planning things that we can do, tax loss harvesting. But eventually really landed in like, okay, well, I'm working with some Bitcoin miners and we've got to do their accounting. We've got to get their Bitcoin transactions into QuickBooks. And it's very manual. There's not really great tooling to get it done efficiently, like your Chase bank account transactions flow through. And so that's kind of where Bitment was born, was through that pain in my own practice. And we can get into it, but the story from there is I knew a software developer who was also a big Bitcoiner, and I've been, you know, I always say I've been pulling at his pant leg for call it about 2 years now to build this product because it's a gap in the market. Everyone focuses on the tax side if they focus on financial services for Bitcoin at all, and they've really left accounting out to dry. And the result is accountants just have to end up spending countless hours to get transactions into a set of books alongside fiat. So yeah, I'll pause there.
Yeah, I think you're going back to we're going to jump into Bitment in just one moment, but you're an accountant, and I think many people who are not accountants see Bitcoin as speculative. But I think my experience with accountants is a lot of the old school accountants are very are I don't know if they're speculative. They're a little cautious about Bitcoin as a venture. But how did you got into this, a few years ago, and how do you view it from a business and strategic perspective, uh, Bitcoin in general?
Yeah, I mean, it's the most interesting part about it from an accounting standpoint is that it is at the end of the day it's a network, which is just a ledger system, right? And so the whole I've got a wallet, I've got an address, and that shows a certain balance, and you've got an address, and when we make a transaction, one goes up, one goes down, everything has to always balance. And then you tack on top of that that it's a consensus built system where we all have to agree on the ledger, with our nodes to actually just verify things. Because one of the big things in accounting, right, and we've seen it with fraud cases and all the like Enron, whatever, pick your favorite example, is someone can go back and they can change something that was recorded in their books, and they can misrepresent what actually happened. And so the immutability of the Bitcoin ledger, I think, is something that an accountant sees that and it's kind of like a light bulb moment of wow, that is an advancement of the accounting technology that we don't have today. Because you still can, if you get collusion among certain parties in a corporation, you can definitely cook the books, and you can misrepresent the how well your business is performing or not so well. And so I would always point to that, and I can't remember the guy's name. He's a miner. I'd have to go back and look. It was on the What Bitcoin Did podcast, but he had an accounting background, which is funny. A lot of people I meet in the Bitcoin space actually have an accounting background, but they don't do accounting quite anymore. Weedlove's another example. Um, but all that to say, I think the immutability of the ledger to know this is what happened, and we all agree on that, and that's basic. Like we close the books basically every 10 minutes, and and then we all have to agree on that version of the ledger or the books to keep going forward. I think that that just gives, to go back to your question, it gives accountants this level of certainty about this is what actually happened, and we can prove that this is what actually happened, and no one can go back and manipulate that for whatever reason.
That's well said. When I looked at your product, for me, I'm a creative, and accounting and, putting things into a ledger, it's super boring to me. Like, it's something I don't want to do. And I think a lot of business owners, they don't want to do that. They want to run a Bitcoin mine. They want to
Yeah.
build something. They want to figure out, how to hook the electrical up and buy that right transformer. That's fun, for
Right.
the Bitcoin miner, the DIYer. We're builders and doers. And to get into the books, I mean, this doesn't sound like the most fun use of my time, but it's the most important because we just got through April 15th. And if anybody did their taxes at the last minute, like me, you look back at your books and you say, "Wow, if I would have done things different last year, I could have done this or done that." And there's so many business owners who today are saying, "You know what? I'm going to mark down every transaction I do so that next year my taxes are going to be so much easier." How long we will last, we don't know. Um, but this is boring. So why is this Bitment your product? First, tell us about your product, and then tell us why it's so important for us to implement it into our Bitcoin business.
Yeah. Yeah, and honestly, I'm fine with it being a boring business. There's quite a bit of maybe hype is the right word on Twitter about boring businesses, and that they're actually kind of making a little bit of a comeback, whether it's whatever it is, right? Because all of us in our own way are going to have to compete with artificial intelligence. The accounting world is no different, right? But the boring businesses of like what no one else is willing to do, I think that there's tons of opportunity in those spaces. And as things stand today, I'll just make a quick note. The accounting space is one of those spaces, especially if you wanted to get into accounting from a Bitcoin standpoint and be an actual practitioner. So someone who is helping someone with their tax returns or with their books or doing consulting. Um, the younger generation that's coming up behind a large swath of guys who are retiring in their 60s or 70s, it's a mismatch. So that's something I just wanted to maybe point out real fast, is that if you're a younger person and you're not sure what you want to do career wise, but you've studied accounting, or maybe you're on a finance track, but you took some accounting and you have time to potentially make a switch. I think the accounting industry is a great starting place for a lot of younger people if it's something that clicks, and it's not something that clicks for everybody. So it gives you a really solid foundation for business, and then you can always take that into the future in whatever you end up doing. If you switch to finance, or if you end up becoming an entrepreneur and you're the partner that kind of helps handle or at least review the financial and accounting side of things, I think that that's just useful. Now, getting back to our product, so our product is a boring business of, hey, Bitcoin accounting does not fit well within traditional fiat accounting. There's several reasons for that, but mainly it's a tech play right now. QuickBooks is the largest, for small business owners, it's the largest accounting software, most widely used. And, you know, not to get too much in the weeds, but basically you would, if you had your QuickBooks open, you would go connect your Chase Bank account. And it's, if you've ever used Plaid, it's very straightforward. You click the button, add an account, you log in with your credentials, You pick the account and then you plug it in, you map it to the correct chart of account in your QuickBooks, and it magically starts pulling in transactions. You hit a little update button every day and it pulls in the new transactions. It's a beautiful thing. And then from there, you can write rules. You can automate that even to have those transactions be automated. Such is not the case for Bitcoin transactions. I've talked with a lot of Bitcoin accountants since starting this company, and it is, you know, it is a lot of design work, I would say, in Excel of doing subledgering of transactions and then pulling those transactions in either by a CSV file or doing a monthly adjusting journal entry to pull those transactions in. All that to say, it's not near as straightforward as that Plaid connection. And so, what we're trying to do, I would say, is build that Plaid connection for Bitcoin on chain, Lightning, and even eventually eCash, so that any business that wants to operate more so on a Bitcoin standard can do so and not have to pay astronomical accounting fees because their accountant's like, look, I don't know what you're doing here, or I do know what you're doing here, but my team has to do a ton of manual labor to get this data correctly into your books. So I would say we're trying to make it more efficient for the accountant side. But ultimately, we think Bitcoin's a better asset and a better way to transact. And so we want to make the accounting side that while it is boring, it is absolutely needed, whether you are sending your financials to your tax person or you're sending it to your board or to other investors. It's just a fact of life. The accounting has to be dialed in. Plus, you just want to know, you want to know, is your business profitable, or do you need to go get cash or more Bitcoin, whatever it might be.
I think what you're doing is such a useful tool to help implement Bitcoin on a wider scale. I think there's so many roadblocks and limitations that keep businesses from using Bitcoin as a currency or doing transactions in Bitcoin because of, the accountants say, hey, this is a lot more work and it's going to cost you a lot of money. All these barriers to entry reduce the widespread adoption of Bitcoin. So what you're doing is, really aligns with the zero factor, which is what I talk about a lot. How can we get the other 95% of the world to understand what Bitcoin is and use it? And I know that you're really passionate about, you said earlier in our pre-show that business is coming into Bitcoin, or Bitcoin is coming into business, business is coming into Bitcoin. Um,
Mhm.
what does that look like, and what do you mean by that? Yeah,
Yeah,
so
so I would say you're most prominently seeing it with Bitcoin treasury strategies, I would say. Um, so most of the people that I'm talking to, it's more so, hey, Bitcoin is just a better store value than treasuries, definitely cash, and so holding Bitcoin on a company balance sheet to beat inflation over the long run, and um, yeah, just basically have a better money on there. Now, there's also this very I don't know. There's a debate going on, right, on the medium exchange versus store value, and I think for small business owners that get Bitcoin, the store value is it's an easier sell because, okay, well, I've got X amount sitting in short-term treasuries, or I've got X amount sitting in this other fairly liquid instrument. I'm just going to move that into Bitcoin, hold it on the balance sheet, and that's going to improve uh, the balance sheet of the company over a long span of time. Now, if you go over to the medium of exchange, it's a totally different story. There's companies like Zapright and guys like Parker Lewis that I've heard speak several times already this year at different conferences. And Parker's ringing the bell of, hey, we need payments. We need people to be invoicing their customers in Bitcoin, at least allowing an option to be paid in Bitcoin or Lightning. You've got people like Jack Dorsey and Jeff Booth recently in the Jeff was like maybe 2 days ago, and Jack was 2 or 3 weeks ago. But them saying that if Bitcoin fails as a medium of exchange, then Bitcoin fails, altogether. And so, where do we go from there? You have to have the tooling in order to actually accept Bitcoin and take it as payment. And so, things like Zaprite are essential to actually get that ball rolling. And I think, based on what I've seen, they've been really successful in terms of trying to get existing Bitcoiners to start invoicing. And obviously they're still young and they're still developing, but I think that that's the best tool I've seen out there for if you're an invoicing type of customer or invoicing type of business, then you should be using them. But then even then, okay, you're receiving Bitcoin, you're receiving it into a wallet. You use it, you have it auto generate a new address every single time for privacy purposes. How is your accountant getting that, matching those sales into your existing accounting software? And then, let's just take a normal business that's doesn't have huge margins. They're also having to cash some of that Bitcoin out to pay their bills, to cover payroll, to pay taxes. And so then that adds another layer of complexity. And I'm not really here to get, there's all kinds of uh, commentary, and we could go down this path a little bit on the cap gains tax. And is that the reason that people don't transact enough in Bitcoin? And, honestly, I could see arguments on both sides. And our tool is well positioned to also solve that problem. Right at this moment, we're just focused on the accounting, but we would have cost basis data that we could pretty easily um, build tax reports for clients as well, and have that auto generated for their accountants come tax reporting time. So, but all that to say, the two functions, store value, medium exchange, that's what I'm seeing on the Bitcoin, the business Bitcoin side of things. And so we're much more solving for the medium of exchange piece, and at least trying to make that much more accessible for the accountant slash business owner that needs to get all that stuff into one set of books.
The talk about medium of exchange versus store of value. And um, I've been asking a lot of people, could Bitcoin add another zero if it was just a store of value? Do you believe it can?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yeah, that would, in my head, that would just be getting to gold's market cap, which I think that puts us close to $1 million for Bitcoin. So, there's, yeah, to me, obviously, I'm always very bullish. I mean, I wouldn't be building a a Bitcoin business, right, if I wasn't bullish on the underlying asset. Um, but yeah, no, I think that's true. I think it could do fine as a store of value, but I think the main the main point is that Americans don't have to worry about medium exchange with dollars, at least knock on wood right this moment. But for other places in the world, Bitcoin is the only option that is outside of a really terrible and tyrannical government system. And pick your favorite example, right? So I think that's really where Jack and Jeff are coming from, is that Bitcoin's a global tool, and so the tooling to transact helps these people in other parts of the world that are not as fortunate as people in the first world to actually transact and run their business, and not have to be fearful that their wealth is going to be stolen from them overnight because of a currency devaluation. So,
That is such a good point. I believe that whether it's Bitcoin or a different cryptocurrency, the greatest value is in the billions of people who live in, let's say, third world or second world countries, the Indias, the Africas. There's so many people there that if and what they're buying is, it's in pennies, it's in cents, it's in dollars, to what we for our transactions. They're small, but there's billions of them, and there's billions of them per day. And the amount of transactions that could happen on a cryptocurrency. So people, I don't know if people really understand, and maybe you could touch on a little bit. You talk about the tyrannical banking systems. There's the colonial banking systems of Africa, and it's colonial in India, I believe. Just touch a little bit on, like, we just see banking. It's like, well, we got banks, some of them fail once in a while here, and, if we gotta send somebody money, it might bounce through a couple banks and it costs us 30 bucks or something, but we don't really understand what a bad banking system means in America, and those countries have been living with it since their existence.
I'm not a huge expert on it, but my understanding is that overnight there can be currency devaluations that basically writes down the value of their currency substantially. So there's that risk, right? And that's just the whole idea that probably most people have heard of at this point. People in Venezuela, right when they get paid, they go straight to the grocery store, right, and they spend their money and convert it to fruit or perishable goods, even to try to make because they know that their currency is going to be worth way less in a week. So there's that piece, right? Anything that is saving that you do have that you're wanting to keep in savings, maybe you keep that in something like a Bitcoin. Um, Much easier to verify and get your hands on than physical gold, especially if you're in a tyrannical country um, and you are fortunate enough to even have savings. How do you have access to a market where you can actually purchase gold or even paper gold, which obviously you don't even want to own a gold note, right? So I think it opens up the world to um, anyone with a cell phone. They can now get access to a better way to store their wealth, even if they're only going to store it there for 6 months because they're saving up for something. But at least they know that there's more stability in that than keeping it in their local currency. And then one last point, I'm sure that people are familiar with this as well. It's easy for Americans to poo-poo the dollar, but we also have access to the dollar easily. Clients pay me in dollars. If I was to go get a W-2 job, I get paid in dollars, and that's not the case for billions of people around the world. So that's the other. Obviously, everyone's seen the tether, the stable coin kind of phrase. I don't know what you want to call it, but all of that is demand for dollars, and I kind of see it as like the dollar is the best of the fiat currencies, and then from there, if you wanted to store for longer term, um, obviously you have much better options than the dollar if you're in America, um, whether that's Bitcoin, gold, real estate, even some equities maybe. But in other parts of the world, it's just much harder to get your hands in any of those other asset classes versus if you're able to download an app on your phone and get access to Bitcoin from your local currency, you're going to do that. So, and then you can transact. I mean, then there's the whole transacting and the censorship resistance. I mean, that's something that spoke to me. Things started to click for me and Bitcoin. If you're a church and you're trying to take donations and maybe and everyone I think will find themselves, it's not specific to one ideology or one really anything. Everyone at some point will find themselves where they don't have the exact same beliefs as the reigning government at the time, even if you're in America, right? And so I think there's just a good argument on the even on the censorship resistant side of Bitcoin for Americans to think to themselves, hey, you know, maybe I was for the last guy or I'm for this guy and we see eye to eye now, but whatever it is, right? Those things change every 4 years. And so Bitcoin allows you to sleep well at night knowing that you've got money that cannot be you can transact without anybody stopping it in the middle because the White House called up Chase Bank and said, debank this guy, which we saw quite a bit of
Mhm.
that in the crypto industry. So yeah,
Yes,
those are some of my thoughts on that.
candidates will come and go, but Bitcoin is forever.
Yeah.
There we go. Little Wu-Tang reference. So, a question. So how do you get paid? I recognize that this is a great idea for India. This is a great idea for Africa, where they have colonial banking systems or other really just bad ways of buying and selling things, Venezuela. But for, this the small business owner, for the manufacturer, or a company that's working in America, how do you get paid? Do you reevaluate your work in Bitcoin as opposed to dollars, or
Oh,
how? Like, what's the strategy behind that?
I mean, I would say we're still too early to be pricing things, even in sats. Like, in my head, I kind of think, I know it's not exactly true right this moment, but $100,000 Bitcoin, I think it was roughly, I think it is 1,000 sats per dollar. And so I've kind of, at least in my head, I have a reference now of like, okay, $20 is roughly 20,000 sats. We're at 84. Okay, so it's a little bit less, right? But I think people could start to think that way, but that's going to take a long time. I'm looking at a building out the window. I have no idea what maybe that building's worth four or $500,000, but in sats, it's too much to do all the math, right? And so I think and that speaks to the unit of count. And I think we'll get there at some point, but right this moment, the dollars is very much the unit of account when people are pricing anything. And so, at least how I think about it, John, is if I'm going to send an invoice in Bitcoin to do someone's tax return, for example, I just price it uh, whatever the dollar price is, and then Zaprite allows you to either tack on a premium to pay in dollars or a discount to pay in Bitcoin. And then, say they pay in Bitcoin, those sats, flow to the wallet or Lightning wallet that you have assigned. And then from there, it does, and that's part of our tool is you've got to be able to track that on the balance sheet because now, again, if you're a low margin business, there's a high likelihood that someone on your team has to then transfer that Bitcoin to an exchange to sell it back to the local currency to pay the bills. And so, because we're most likely not there where you're also paying out your employees all in Bitcoin, or you're paying your rent in Bitcoin, whatever it might be, right? So that's the other piece that we're trying to solve for is that cash, or if you want to call it SATS management of here's what's coming in the door, here's what's going out the door, and we got to make sure that it's actually set up to go out the door in the correct form. And so that's maybe one more hurdle. But the biggest hurdle I would say is making sure that all your income and all your expenses are all represented on one profit and loss statement. That's kind of like, and do it all using dollar denominated values, right? I mean, that's where we're starting. We're not too focused right this moment on getting Bitcoin denominated uh, values into a set of books. Could we go there? We definitely could go there. And if a business owner wants to see their balance sheet denominated in dollars and Bitcoin, similar to if you had euros and dollars and yen, we could do that. But I think the very first step is, in my use case, from a selfish standpoint, it is I got to get it on a tax return. Everything on the tax return is going to be denominated in dollars. So let's build the accounting tool to feed everything, even if it was Bitcoin related activity, it's going to be priced in dollars when it hits the books, and that's kind of called the MVP, right? So that's kind of where we're starting at, and then we'd
Yeah.
love to branch out um, to having a set of books where people can denominate it in Bitcoin or in dollars or in both if they wanted to.
Yep. I think what your product does is it gives us a first step for implementing Bitcoin into business and business into Bitcoin in a very understandable way that um, I think the old thought of when people said, "Hey, you got to pay me in Bitcoin," that had a negative connotation, and we're getting past that, and now we're looking at, "Hey, you can pay me in Bitcoin, and it's a legitimate way of doing it. We're going to work around the fees like credit card fees or all of those other things that make the cost of money. My business primarily runs in people paying in credit card and me paying other people in different types of forms. So my cost of money is almost 5%. And I think by going into Bitcoin, you could reduce that greatly, and reduce that cost of money, that is just such a huge part of the
Yeah,
businesses
and
that
but
we
where you have to
run.
be careful with this very specific spot we're in is you could be trading. You save 5% over here on the Amex fee, right? But then you pay maybe five or maybe even more in your accounting fees because it's going to take those guys so much longer. So what we're really trying to do is like let's get as close to the net 5% savings as possible because the accounting side it flows and it speaks the same exact language as what your bookkeeper's already used to. And there is, you know, in several different fronts in the Bitcoin space, we are in this kind of middle ground, right? Of like, it's not perfect, but we all are like, we are early. And so we're making some sacrifices, right? To kind of move the ball forward. And maybe that sacrifice is, yes, you are transacting much more in Bitcoin. Yes, it adds an additional burden on the accounting and tax side, but you march through that because you know that we all have to kind of be moving towards this goal of being on a Bitcoin standard. And the tooling will follow um, the market needs, and so that's where I think we find ourselves right this moment. Is again, I talked to guys down in Nashville, Joe at Satoshi Pacioli, big accounting firm down there that they work with exclusively with Bitcoin clients. It's one of those things where there is a lot of manual labor that goes into their work right this moment. We're moving towards a world where it works the same as Plaid works. Um, Really quick, just so everyone knows exactly, I just want to do a quick like this is what we're building kind of thing. So it's you'd plug in your Bitcoin address within our web app. You would that pulls all the transactions in, actually creates a bank statement, a monthly bank statement or annual bank statement, whatever you need for your purposes. And then, so that's actually already built the bank statement piece, and that's useful for I would say again mostly for accountants. Then we're taking the code base what we're working on right this moment as a QuickBooks plugin. So you'd log into your QuickBooks through our site. You'd map your Bitcoin XPub or address directly into one of your Bitcoin or into one of your QuickBooks chart of accounts. And then those transactions would start flowing through so that now your bookkeeper has your set of fiat transactions that they need to categorize. And then in the same spot, you'd have your Bitcoin transactions that need to also be categorized. And then for an accountant, they would or bookkeeper, they'd go in, they'd categorize all that like that's normal, right? And then they'd come back to our bank statement and they would reconcile. And all that really means is tie back what was recorded on the blockchain to what is in the books and make sure that they roughly match is what I should say. And they're not, there's some certain circumstances where they're not always going to match, but for the most part, you want to make sure there's no duplicates, there's nothing missing. And if there is anything that's different, you understand why. And maybe they're not, it's not as predominant in the Bitcoin space, but maybe you write a check, right? In the real world, you write a check. In the traditional world, write a check. It hasn't been deposited as the month end, so that's going to be an unreconciled item. So, kind of getting into the weeds a little bit there, but that's like our main tool right this moment is just bank statement. Feed that into QuickBooks. Use the bank statement to reconcile. And do it all within a QuickBooks setup right this moment. We're open to expanding to other accounting softwares as well in the future.
And we'll put all your information right here below, your website, how to get in contact with you so that everybody can contact you easily. And
Yeah.
Jordan, this has been fascinating. I'm really into the tax side of things, and I'm gonna pick your brain on a couple other ideas I have on a call next week. But for now, this has
Cool.
been fantastic. I really appreciate you taking the time to explain Bitment to us, and then also explain how Bitcoin is coming to business, and
Yeah.
you know, and getting business on the Bitcoin standard. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll leave you with just a couple teasers for maybe our next conversation. One would be in a Bitcoin treasury setup. Do you do it same as real estate, where you actually hold the Bitcoin in a separate LLC? That's one that we could discuss at a future date. And then the other one is we can just talk through the tax implications of operating a business using Bitcoin and what all goes into that, so that someone could be planning for their taxes um, adequately. So I'll leave it there though, because I know we talked about potentially doing a few of these. So
Yeah, so we'll definitely do that. I think, uh, here's what we'll do. Let me just put this in here. Okay. Thank you for joining us today, Jordan. I really appreciate it, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode.
all right, thanks, John.